Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at this cozy campfire scene that I recently made in Blender using both 3D and 2D elements with grease pencil. This was actually a background that I made for a good friend of mine's Twitch stream. I won't be showing the full process from start to finish here, but rather just breaking down each element and how I pieced them together to create this final scene. Still, I hope you find this useful and I'll be sharing a few tips along the way. But first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you for all the support on the previous video. I honestly wasn't expecting such a response, but I'm so glad to have helped some of you out in achieving this sort of style within Blender, and it's been amazing seeing what some of you have created with the same techniques. But for now, let's get back to today's video. So this scene is made up of a few distinct elements. The background, which is entirely 2D, the foreground, which is a mix of both 2D and 3D, and finally the character along with some animations. Let's start off with the background. So backing out of our camera view for a moment, you'll notice that this background is made up of a number of grease pencil drawings that are spread out across the 3D space. This is necessary for a little effect I'm going to be showing you in just a bit. But if we take a closer look at these drawings, like these hills at the front for example, you'll notice that they're made up of three simple layers: the line art, the fill color, and the shadow color. The shadow layer here has its blend mode set to multiply and has a low opacity. I'm also making use of the masks feature here, which works very similarly to clipping masks in other painting programs like Photoshop. Basically what that means is wherever I draw here on the shadow layer, it will only show up within the bounds of our fill color. And I have the exact same setup on the other layers for the mountains and clouds. Now, I also made a lot of use of the Sculpt mode within Grease Pencil, which if you weren't aware of is a great way to edit your strokes after you've drawn them in. And you can access that either with the drop down menu up here in the top left or by using the pie menu. There's a number of useful tools here such as smoothing and adjusting the thickness of your strokes, but I mostly made use of the push and grab tools here. And if we zoom in a little bit and unlock these layers here, basically what these do is allow me to sort of push and pull these strokes around until I find the shape that I'm after. I also used the randomize tool here, which if we use it on these lines here, adds a bit of noise and gives the impression of sort of bumpy terrain. Also, if you hold shift here, no matter what tool you're using, it will smooth things out like so. Now, sometimes you may find that you don't have enough points to get a smooth sculpt with, and that's easily fixed by jumping into edit mode, selecting the stroke that you want to edit, coming up to stroke at the top here and hitting subdivide, which will give you more points to work with. You can also use a subdivide modifier like I've done here if you want a less destructive method. Now let's talk about this distant fog effect. If we move our camera in and out, you'll see the effect a bit more clearly. In Blender, there's typically two ways of doing this: using the mist pass and the compositor, or using volumetrics. Unfortunately, neither of these methods work with grease pencil objects, as far as I'm aware. So how did I achieve this? Well, we just need to work with a few modifiers. I found out about this trick from this video. I suggest you check them out. So hopping over to our grease pencil object, I'll remove these modifiers so I can show you how to set it up step by step. Firstly, we'll need to add a vertex weight proximity modifier, and we'll need to input a few things here. Firstly, we'll need to set up a vertex group, and you can easily do that by jumping into the layers tab here and scrolling down to vertex group, hitting plus, and I just had one set up here called fog. Add the vertex group you just created in here and set your target object to the camera in your scene. Basically what this is doing is adding weight to the objects depending on how far away they are from our camera. Now this isn't doing much at the moment, so next we'll add a tint modifier, and by default this just adds a flat tint across all of our objects, which isn't what we want. So we're going to use the weight generated here to drive our tint effect. And to do that, under influence here, set your vertex group once again to fog, and instead of using this strength value, we'll hit this little button next to it to use weights. Now you can start to see the effect in action, and we can use these lowest and highest values to affect the strength of our fog effect and how far away from the camera the effect starts. And again, this is why I had the drawings spread out on the 3D space, because if we had just drawn everything on one flat plane, this effect wouldn't work. And we can use the color here in the tint modifier to adjust the color of our fog. I set it to a nice pale blue to match our sky. And speaking of the sky, let's quickly see how I set that up by jumping over to the shader editor and hiding our background for now. Under the world settings, much like in my previous video, I have separated the lighting and the color of the background by using two background nodes plugged into a mix shader and using the is camera ray option of the light path as the factor. But instead of a flat color, I have a nice gradient here. And to set that up, we just need to add a gradient texture node and plug a texture coordinate and mapping node into that. If you have Node Wrangler, you can quickly do this by selecting the gradient texture and hitting Ctrl T. To make the gradient vertical, make sure to rotate it by 90 degrees on the y-axis, and you can now plug this texture into a color ramp to adjust the colors and the blend. And that's it for the background. Let's take a look at the foreground. So as I said at the beginning, the foreground is made up of both 2D and 3D elements, and we'll quickly take a look at the 3D first. So if I just hide our grease pencil layers, you can see here exactly what's left. We have our ground plane, a nice little tent, a log, and a little campfire with a cooking pot. And if I enable wireframe up here in our viewport overlays, you can see that they're all fairly simple meshes that I made with some basic modeling techniques. Let's take a look at the materials for these objects, which are all using the same simple toon shader that I've used before, which consists of a principled BSDF plugged into a shader to RGB and a color ramp set to constant, which lets us adjust our light and shadow colors. I'm also making use of multiple material slots again, such as within this ground, you'll see that all these faces here are assigned to the green grass material, whereas this one in the middle is assigned to our dirt material. As for the lighting in the scene, I'm simply making use of this one sun lamp, which has its strength set to about 5 and its angle and shadow bias set as low as they can be, just for some nice clean shadows. Okay, now let's re-enable the grease pencil objects for our foreground, and you'll see all of the hand-drawn details. The meshes here are also making use of the line art modifier within grease pencil. I go into a bit more detail about how this works in my previous video, but basically every object that is in our collection here is having its outline drawn from the camera. If I enable and disable the visibility here, you can see exactly what it's doing here. And as for these details on the tent and the log, for example, I'm simply making use of the surface stroke placement within draw mode, which allows me to draw directly on the surface of the mesh, like so. Again, if any of this confuses you, please go check out my previous video as I go into a bit more detail about how Grease Pencil works and how to combine it with 3D objects. As for all the foliage here, I've simply drawn in a few layers of bushes here and some grass, and once again spread them out a little bit on the 3D space and gradually darkened their colour towards the camera just to give a bit of depth. And also just on the ground plane here, I've drawn in a few stones and some blobs of dirt just for a bit of extra detail. And that's it for the majority of the foreground elements. Now let's take a quick look at our character here. Okay, so I won't spend a ton of time here as character modeling and rigging is a whole other subject, one that I don't feel best qualified to explain as I haven't done a ton of it myself, but there are loads of great tutorials out there for creating simple, stylized characters like this, and I'll link a few that I've personally found helpful down in the description. But if we take a look at our little cat here, you can maybe guess he's very much based on the style of Animal Crossing characters with the sort of big head and rounded hands. In regards to texturing, I went with the more traditional method of UV unwrapping the model and drawing in the details with texture paint. As with 3D characters, I feel like this is a much more usable method than doing it with Grease Pencil, and it allows a bit more freedom if, for example, you wanted to export this character along with its textures to a game engine, as unfortunately that's not possible with Grease Pencil objects. Also, you'll see that his eyes here are drawn on a separate mesh that is hovering just in front of his face, and they have their own texture. This made it easy for me to animate his eyes blinking, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. So jumping into rendered mode, you'll see that he's got the same toon shader that I used for all the environment pieces, and to make that work with textures, it's super simple. Firstly, we just need to set up our toon shader in the same way. Here I just use a diffuse BSDF, but once again plugged into a shader to RGB and into a color ramp. And by using a mix node here, plug your image texture into the top slot and your color ramp into the bottom. Make sure this is set to color and this is set to multiply. And in your color ramp, what would typically be the light color of your toon shader, set that to white so it doesn't affect our texture, and then you can use this second color to adjust your shadow. The factor setting here will also affect the strength of your shadows. Now, as for our outline here, you may notice that I'm not using the line art modifier from Grease Pencil for this, but rather the solidify or inverted hull method, however you want to call it. And as it sounds, it makes use of the solidify modifier here, and that is effectively duplicating your mesh on top of itself, but then flipping the normals and removing the back faces so that we only see the sort of outer edge here. And if I turn it on and off, you can see exactly what it's doing here. Again, there's lots of great tutorials out there explaining this, but I'll quickly run you through how I set this up. So I'll just remove the solidify modifier for now. And first, in our materials, you'll notice that I have an outline material set up. And that is simply just a flat emission shader with its own color. And in the settings, you want to make sure to check back face culling and shadow mode to none. Now you can add a solidify modifier to your mesh. Check even thickness here, and under normals, make sure to check flip. And in materials, we'll want to set our material offset to our outline. So we can see in our material slots that our outline is our third material, so we'll need to offset that by 2 in our modifier. But you can also just set this to a high number like 100 and it will always use the last slot in your materials here. Now you can see it in action, but obviously this is way too thick, so we can just adjust this thickness modifier here till we get what we're after. Now you'll see going into the minus here will actually push the outline outwards, whether in the positive values it will push it inwards. Now you can sort of mess with this a little bit, either way works, but you can change the values around until you find what works best for you. And that's pretty much it. Now the obvious benefit of this compared to the line art modifier is that it's not drawn from the camera, so no matter how we spin around here out of camera, we can see the outline working. Both options work in their own way, and you've seen that I use both in this project, so just use whatever meets your needs and works best for your own art. Finally, let's touch on some animation. Again, this isn't an animation tutorial, but I'll explain how I quickly got him rigged and ready to animate using a free add-on that comes with Blender called Rigify. And to enable that, you just need to jump into Edit and Preferences, and under Add-ons, search for Rigify and check it. Now, the great thing about Rigify is that it comes with a lot of pre-made armatures for humanoids, but also some animals. And I made use of the basic human rig here, but in edit mode, you can see here that I just adjusted some of the bones to better fit my character's body. Now, I only recently found out that Rigify actually comes with some pre-made building blocks to create your own rigs from scratch, or in my case, add to this existing human rig. And you can find those in your rig settings by going to Rigify here, and in edit mode, under samples here, you can see that these are all the sample bones that you can add, which range from things like spines and heads to tails. And in this case, you'll see that along with this human rig, I added a tailbone here, as well as a basic chain of bones up here for his ears. And once you're done with your rig here, within Rigify, you can hit Generate Rig here, and that will create this really nice control rig, which you can now parent your mesh to and easily start posing with these helpful points. And when it came to actually animating him, I made use of the action editor here within the dope sheet so that I could store and work on each animation separately, like the sharpening one. His sword and stone here were just parented to his hand bones so that they followed their movements. Lastly, I said I'd touch on how I animated his blinking eyes. And again, since they're on their own texture, all I had to do here was use the mapping node to adjust the UV location to be either on the open eyes or closed eyes, and then keyframe those in. Just make sure your interpolation mode is set to constant, as we don't want them smoothly transitioning between each other like this. Alright, now let's take a quick look at the subtle environment animations. Now, a great thing about Grease Pencil is that it can be animated in a number of different ways, from the traditional frame-by-frame animation to even using bones. But here, I decided to use lattices, and if I enable my extra objects here, you can see them at work. And I have a few of them spread out here for each layer of bushes. So a lattice effectively works like a cage around your object, which you can use to deform with by adding a lattice modifier to your object and setting your lattice. So taking this lattice for example, you can see that it's connected to this set of bushes, and within the lattice settings itself, I have its V resolution set to 1 so that it's a totally flat plane. And as for how I animated these, I used shape keys. Now, shape keys basically allow you to have multiple versions of your mesh that can all be edited and adjusted without affecting your original mesh. And then you can morph between these shapes by using this value here. So for example, if we take our first shape key here and pop into edit mode, I can drag this point up here, and then if we play our animation, you can see it morphing between. And to animate this change, all you have to do is keyframe that value setting. And that's pretty much all it is, just a few shape keys morphing the bushes from side to side to mimic the effect of wind brushing through them. And the only other thing to mention here is this cooking pot, in which I just keyframed its rotation to have it swing around in the wind. Lastly, let's see how I turn this into a night scene. So the majority of the work here was just adjusting the material colors themselves. I darkened and desaturated most of the colors while also hue shifting them a little more towards blue. With the background, the fog has a much darker but more saturated blue tint. With our main light, I just slightly reduced the strength of our sun lamp from 5 to just under 2. And as for our sky, you'll see that I removed the clouds and added in some nice stars. So let's take a look at that. So looking at our world settings, everything here is pretty much the same with the gradient, except I now have it as a sort of deep bluish purple pushing up into black. And as for the stars themselves, I used a Voronoi texture. Once again, plugging a texture coordinate and mapping node into it, but this time using the camera setting of the texture coordinate. On the Voronoi texture itself, I'm using the 4D, F1 and Manhattan settings, and I'm plugging the distance into a color ramp, which gives me these hard diamond shapes that I can then adjust the size of. This color ramp is then plugging into another mix node, which I'm mixing with gradient, but this time using the color dodge setting. And finally, this result is then plugged into our background as normal. As for how I'm animating these stars, I'm simply keyframing this W value on the Voronoi texture. I'm using very low values here, as by default when you shift this, it moves the stars around quite a lot. But if you set it to extremely low values like I've done here, you can see we have a gentle sort of twinkling effect. Now let's take a quick look at the fire and its particles. So taking a look in solid mode, you'll see that the fire started off as just this sort of pointed blob shape, but I'm then using a displace modifier which changes the shape of the object based on a texture. I'm then animating the coordinates of that texture to give it a sort of wavy effect like so. Down here in the texture properties, the fire texture I created is just a Musgrave texture. And as for how I animated this, I'm using the object coordinates of this empty that I created. To see exactly what that's doing, if I grab said empty object and start moving it around the scene, you'll see as I move, it's adjusting our displacement. Now, as to how I automated this movement, I believe I have everything below here. So down here we have our empty, but I also have a Bezier circle. Now within the empty's object constraints, I have it set to follow the path of our Bezier circle. And by keyframing the offset setting, if we hit play, you'll see that the empty is now spinning round and following the path of our circle. And this movement is changing our displacement. I reduced this influence setting here as the movement with the default value here was a bit too strong. When keyframing that offset setting, I made sure at the start of our animation the value was 0 and at the end it was 360, so that it made a full loop around the circle. As for the material of the fire, I'm using a very similar gradient setup like I did with our background and sky, but I'm then plugging this into an emission shader with its strength set to 2 so that we get a nice glow effect. Make sure bloom is checked in your render properties to see this effect. I'm also making use of the solidify outline method like I did with the character. Now the other part of our fire here is of course the particles. And again, there's a lot to talk about with particle systems, but I'll quickly run you through my setup as it's fairly basic. So you'll see that I have a invisible flat plane here, which I have added the particle system to, and that is acting as our emitter. I'm rendering the particles as an object, and our object is this ember object that I've created, which is simply just a small sphere which has the same fire material and outline as the main fire here. Under field weights, I've made sure to remove all gravity so that the particles float upwards, and I have a fairly low velocity here with a bit of randomization. You'll also see that the particles start off small before enlarging and then fading out again. We can do that by driving the scale of our objects with a texture. And if we head into our textures tab here, you'll see that I've created a simple blend texture, and by using a color ramp I'm setting it to start as black, fade into white before fading back into black. And we make this affect the size of our particles by going into the influence drop down here and checking the size. So basically the darker the color here, the smaller the object, and as it gradually fades into white, it'll get larger before fading out again. Now the difficult part here was actually getting these particles to loop nicely with this animation. And the way we do that is by duplicating our particle system and offsetting them by half the length of our animation. So my animation is 240 frames long. And if we look at this first particle system, instead of starting at 0, you'll see that I've started at minus 120 frames and ending at 120, which is halfway through our animation. And then our second particle system starts halfway through at 120 and ends 120 frames after the end of our animation at 360. So what that means is at the start of our animation, we will be halfway through our first particle system, and at the end, we'll be halfway through the second particle system. And if both of your particle settings are the exact same on both of these, then you should have a nice loop. And now the last part of our fire here is just this spot lamp here, which I have pointed down towards the fire, and I'm just keyframing the size of the spot shape so it goes in and out and sort of recreates the effect of the light of the fire flickering. Final touch to this scene was adding a vignette effect using the compositor. If we hop over to the compositing tab, make sure use nodes is checked here. You'll want to add in an ellipse mask node, shape it so that it fits your render, then blur that with a Gaussian blur before multiplying it on top of your final image. And there we have it, all the layers that brought this scene to life. This video ended up a lot longer than I was expecting, so if you've stuck around to this point, I really appreciate it, and I hope you picked up something from this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you around.